is a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Carnegie Middle East Center. His book, Owners of the Republic: An Anatomy of Egypt's Military Economy, is a reference for anyone seeking to understand Egypt's military economy. So with that, I want to thank you again all for joining, and we'll go straight into our questions with our speakers. First, I'd like to turn to Ishaq, and I want to mention that this conversation is happening in the context of a compendium of pieces that Yazid and his colleagues published with the Carnegie Middle East Center around the state ownership policy and the challenges surrounding its implementation. And so each of our panelists are authors in this compendium, and I invite you to visit the Carnegie website to read more of the research on this. So I wanted to start with Ishaq. In your piece, you raised important questions about how realistic the projections of both the Egyptian government and the IMF were in terms of either investment rates on the part of the government projections or the growth rate on the part of both. If the IMF's program economic forecasting is untenable, what does this mean for the chances of getting Egypt's economic crisis under control? And how worrying are the prospects?
Well, thanks, Tim. It's a good question. I mean, first of all, I'm very honored to be with such a great group of experts on Egypt. And indeed, it's good to start, as you said, with the big picture of growth and how realistic the growth projections are. And you started already laying some of the essential element of this. I mean, we can start by recalling that Egypt's growth rate has been relatively low in the past decade, 3.5%, as opposed to in the 2010s, 5.5%. And growth is very essential in Egypt to create jobs for all the young people coming to the market, to reduce poverty, and increasingly also to service its rising debts. Now, clearly, the recent shocks didn't help. COVID, followed by Ukraine, and then the fight against inflation. But there are some more structural reasons why growth is coming down in Egypt. And let's also remember that in the last decade, it was kept up because of the discovery of gas, which is not likely to happen in the future. So really, the reactor to the economy has only been state spending on infrastructure in recent years, and not the private sector investing and exporting. And this been the case for a while. And the large IMF program that you spoke about of 2016 didn't solve this problem. It gave a stamp of approval that allowed Egypt to go out to the market and borrowed more, $100 billion more externally, much more internally, but to delay reform as opposed to invest in increasing the productive capacity of the country. This is not tenable. Especially that all this, a lot of this was external debt, and export didn't rise, so the capacity to service this debt has not risen. And so, sooner or later, this house of cards had to fall, and it felt, recently with this series of shocks. So where are we now? In a way, it's a repeat of the 2016 crisis. They're not enough foreign exchange to pay for imports. The capital market on which Egypt has come to depend is nervous because of these, because they're not taking seriously those growth rates that are projected. And as a result, there's no access to the capital market, therefore not possible to refinance debts that come due. Therefore, you have to cut on imports, which is recessionary. Which pushes the currency to devalue, creates inflation, and can lead to social problems. And so there is a fear, if those projections are not credible, of a falling cycle of worse things to come. And so really, if the policy frame, and that's now what's most important, is what do we hear the government saying about the policy reform that would actually make these projections more credible? If the policy frame does not evolve quickly in a way to make these projected growth rates more realistic, Egypt will continue to suffer from this liquidity squeeze. It's a liquidity squeeze at this stage. Egypt needs maybe $20 billion a year. It's a very large $400 billion economy. Normally, it should be able to raise this kind of money. But if over time this is not solved, then compounded with this weak economic structure, will start to move towards a situation of insolvency, kind of the Lebanon route, if you like. So how to stop this descent is now absolutely central. How to stabilize the situation, how to bring back capital flows. You need some credible policy that the government will be addressing the main problem, getting more reactors to this economy, getting the private sector to invest. The investments rate are down to historical low at this stage. And at the same time, reducing the social tension with some effective social protection measures. And just selling the family jewels, I'm sure we'll talk about that, is not sufficient. You'll sell them all, and if income is not rising, you would stay where you are. So I think this is what we're going to talk about today, is how to reform policy in a way that can credibly stop the descent and put Egypt on a credible growth path.
Thank you, Ishaq. No, that's both illuminating and worrying, I guess, which is the situation that we're facing right now. But on the family jewels that you just mentioned, Bob, in your piece, you talked about this issue of the sale of public assets not just being valuables to be liquidated, but they're also important sources of revenue for the Egyptian state. And if we're seeing problems with growth in Egypt, Egypt's already spending half its revenue on debt servicing. Can you tell us a bit about kind of the companies that are being sold and the implications for state revenue in the context of all of these challenges, and what this could mean for the Egyptian state in light of its already sizable deficit spending?
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. Excuse me if I'm coughing. It's because we in Vancouver are being overwhelmed by forest fire smoke. So first day of the long season. And if you'll further excuse me, just a very brief introduction to the family jewels story. And it is basically the matchmaking of the IMF, which obviously didn't want to commit its funds to significant funds to yet another loan to Egypt. And so it served as the matchmaker between several GCC states on the one hand and Egypt on the other. And so you have both reluctant buyers and a reluctant seller. The reluctance of the potential purchasers, namely the GCC states, Hefsa is going to deal with in her comments. And I would just say that, as Ishaq just noted, it's remarkably similar to Lebanon, that the GCC was supporting the Lebanese deficit for years, and then finally decided it was no longer worth the game to be played. And it did so in part because of a structural change in the GCC states, namely that they're sort of following an Israeli strategy of leapfrogging out of the Middle East and North Africa, that they are developing themselves and they see that they can relate to the world. They don't really need the Middle East. So the geopolitical incentives are no longer as strong for GCC potential investors. On the Egyptian side, the reluctance to sell is due, Tim, as you suggested, in significant measure to the fact that the family jewels are a very significant part of the overall political economy of Egypt, and that is both economic and political. That, among other things, some of these companies, especially in the financial sector, the 3 banks and the 2 insurance companies, provided an opportunity for Egypt to sort of fudge the books. So these institutions borrowed internationally in foreign currency, and their debts did not appear in the national accounts because they're being held by those particular companies. So we have seen in the last week, both Fitch and Moody's has downgraded 3 of the principal banks because of their negative net foreign asset position, meaning they owe far more in foreign currency than they actually have or can call upon. So that particular game has been going on for years now, and it's not only that it's enabled Egypt to not reveal the true magnitude of its foreign debt, it's that these financial institutions have been providing significant funds for the government itself. First, in terms of purchasing shares and supporting state-owned enterprises, something like 1/3 of the total assets have gone into loans to state-owned enterprises. But in addition to that, the insurance companies, Mr. and Mr. Life, something like 50% of their assets are in sovereign debt of Egypt. So by virtue of their ownership of these financial institutions, the government of Egypt has been able to reduce its debt burden by virtue of the profits it gains by operating through the banks and the insurance companies. So these are family jewels that actually pay dividends, while at the same time covering up the total indebted position of Egypt. So small wonder it's reluctant to sell, particularly those. Now, there are other areas of the state-owned enterprise policy that are also sensitive for Egypt. One of them is the tourism sector. It was selling off quite literally the family jewels of the most famous hotels in the country. They are on the chopping block. And it's not only that they have a historic value, they actually have a real estate value because the terms and conditions are that they would not only sell, let's say, the Winter Palace and in Luxor and the building, but also the surrounding land upon which it has been agreed that new buildings can be built. In short, you will have a more concrete pouring in these areas to greatly expand the size of these hotels. So these are potentially enormously lucrative assets. And Egypt feels that it's being forced to sell them in a fire sale at below their real value. As tourism recovers, they'd be generating significant revenues. So the Egyptians are obviously reluctant to sell, but just in the last week, the downgrading of now 4 Egyptian banks in light of their indebtedness and lack of foreign currency cover suggests that the back is against the wall. That Egypt is really going to have to bite the bullet here. The sales so far have been only of 2 relatively small shares in Telecom Egypt and the entirety of a small paint company. But the real issue is yet to come, and that's the key of it is the financial sector, and it looks like we're moving in that direction. So Egypt's feet are going to be held to the fire by the Gulf, and there doesn't seem to be any way around it now. Over
Thanks
to you,
a lot, Bob. Thank you, Bob. No, that's so. Despite Egypt's reluctance to sell, and you suspect that they're coming under pressure to the point where they may actually finally move forward with these sales, we also have a reluctant set of buyers in the Gulf. And Hamza, as you noted in your article for this compendium, the IMF program is predicated to a large extent on attracting additional financing in the form of public asset sales to Gulf buyers. And so far, we've seen very few of those sales materialize. Could you give us a sense of some of the main reasons from the perspective of Gulf capitals as to why these sales haven't moved forward and what the main disagreements are between Egypt and their Gulf partners?
Thank you, Tim. And thank you also to Yazid and the Malcolm H. Kerr Center for the invitation to write on this issue as well. Really, on the face of it, a lot of people will talk about the size of the assets, the type of assets that are being presented. It should be noted that all of the possible interest and possible assets that are at least in negotiations with the Gulf have not come from the original list that Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli issued. These are companies that have been added over a series of visits and engagements and discussions. It's notable that today President Sisi arrives in Saudi Arabia for the Arab League Summit. A lot of people focusing on the geopolitical and regional issues around that, but it does give President Sisi another time and another opportunity to engage, if not plead, with his Gulf allies and partners for more concrete support. The reality is under the surface of the fact that fire sales of 10 to 20% is not real state divestment, and as I note in the paper, not to repeat myself, is not enough to attract the Gulf states, the countries. They want ownership and management and control effectively. They want return on their investment, and return on their investment means being able to have the ability to control the outcomes and the trajectories of these companies. And they want a sign of genuine state divestment that shows that Egypt is on a pathway, not just of trying to tape over this current problem and current hole and therefore kick the can down the road even further. The fact that we're sitting here discussing what is a repeat but a far worse crisis than 2016 is only indicative of the both nature, the policy, and the intentions of the Egyptian regime. Let's be frank. that has now moved from a lot of latitude and benefit of the doubt in 2016 from the Gulf states to, I would say, genuine frustration, if not outright anger from the Gulf states. In private, when you speak to officials, particularly from Saudi Arabia and from the UAE, they are incredibly angry at how we've ended up here and how Egypt has ended up in this situation. Beyond that, what we're really seeing is a complete breakdown of trust between these countries and Egypt. The fact that Egypt has not been entrusted to spend properly, to spend, to be prudent in its fiscal management, to be able to implement policies that would have made it a far more prosperous, far more resourceful, far more successful nation under the guise, as we know, particularly, people like myself and you, Tim, who've lived in Egypt for many years, under this guise of protecting sovereign interests, protecting sovereign wealth within the leadership and the military institution. And that erosion of trust is leading to the Gulf states giving an impossible list of conditions, let's be frank. The type of conditions that Egypt, although these are conditions Egypt has been asked to implement by several partners for several years, the sheer pain that will now be invoked on citizens if these are to be put in place all the way is catastrophic for the country, for the citizens, rich and poor, who live there. And that's a major political calculation for the regime at home, which is why you continue to see this massive defiance from the Sisi administration and the military regime. And you continue to see this complete disconnect, if not divorced from reality, position being taken by the prime minister and his government. And that is only, to go back to Ishaq's initial points, we expect and we know, and Egyptians on the ground know, that this is the tip of the iceberg. There is no way but further down for the current situation, even if there's a devaluation, even if we get investment and so on and so forth. And we're really at a crossroads, and it's a case of who blinks first. The reality is the Egyptians must blink. There is no way out of this. And if they don't, we're heading for absolutely cataclysmic shocks on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasna. That is definitely it's definitely a worrying prospect, and the frustrations, are palpable from the Gulf, even in their public statements. They've increasingly vocalized to the press the fact that they're done writing blank checks for the Egyptian government and others, and the frustrations are quite clear. That said, the IMF program has outlined a lot of very specific and significant changes that they expect to see in this program in 46 months, where they want to see a reining in of public sector economic activity. They've named military-owned companies specifically as needing to be reined in. And Yazid, I want to talk to you about this. Have you seen any indication in the past 6 months that the government is actually making a transition? Are we seeing the military slow down their economic activities, or are they continuing to grow their businesses? And also, in your latest article, you pointed out that a lot of military economic activity isn't performed by companies per se, but other military authorities. Could you elaborate on the implications of this for the implementation of the agreement and whether or not it will be effective in bringing this under control? You're on mute.
He did unmute. Thanks, Tim. Well, all indications so far that I've tracked show a continuation of military investment in new production lines, new factories, extending into new areas, including significantly sectors that under the state ownership policy document, the state is supposed to exit. So the military seems to be entirely oblivious to all this, or at the very least to think that until there's a major government decision on any of these assets or sectors, that it should continue with business as usual. And that's pretty much what's happening. Now, what is also very significant, I think, is we see a continuing trajectory of growing military appetite and growing appetite among different parts of the military to get in on the business of doing business in Egypt. So We have, for instance, over the past year, since the new state ownership policy was first put out in draft form, and when Prime Minister Madbouli started talking about a new map for state-private sector relations, in that time, there's been an admiral appointed to a new agency for industrialization, which appears to be attached to the Egyptian Navy. So an indication that the Navy is now being given its own sort of commercial franchise. In the meantime, there's been reporting revealing the role of a government authority of which we hadn't heard previously, except very, very barely, the National Authority for Management and Investment, which has taken ownership of a number of upmarket prestigious hotels and appears to be an arm of the Ministry of Defense. And curiously, for a national authority, there's no report in the official gazette of its establishment that I or others have been able to find. But this too is an indication of getting into a lucrative sector of tourism, obviously. And we now have of course, this has been over a year now, but the Air Force managing a 2 million acre land reclamation project to the west of the Nile Delta. What this suggests to me is that basically every different branch of service in the armed forces, different agencies like the Land Projects Agency of the Armed Forces, which now owns and is leasing out parts of the Cairo waterfront, or the Ministry of Military Production, which has received since Christmas the contract to manage the Cairo Zoo, and so on. It seems that basically everyone wants in on the act. And this has been underway for a while, certainly since I published my big report on the anatomy of the military economy in 2019, in which I argued that there is already signs of overheating of this military economy. There's a sort of gold rush in which different military entrepreneurs want to get involved. And because their accounts are obscure, in fact, are totally non-transparent, non-available to the public, to Parliament, to most government bodies, this means that we can't tell whether any of this is cost effective. Now, you mentioned that my reference to bodies, military bodies that are not officially registered as companies doing business. And that is important because bodies such as the Engineering Authority of the Armed Forces, along with other armed forces departments, the Water Department, the Survey Department, the Mega Projects Department, and so on, these account for probably, in my view, the larger amount, probably by far, of total military income generation compared to the officially registered companies. The companies are mostly involved in areas of manufacture, cultivation, agriculture, in other words, hothouses and so on, and or in certain contracting services and import services. My hunch is that their total turnover is small compared to the amount of funds managed by the Engineering Authority and other armed forces agencies, which undertake massive amounts of publicly funded construction of infrastructure and housing in particular, and including especially the new administrative capital, which has probably soaked up the largest single share of domestic and foreign debt. Now, here's something I want to bring in, and this touches back on what Bob was saying about the banks and where the debt is sort of hidden or tucked away nicely. It appears that what the military are doing in the new administrative capital, where they own 51% of the company that manages the whole project, when they bring real estate developers into the project, they get them either to invest their own funds, or since they usually normally have to borrow, the military doesn't provide any money up front. It redirects them to the banks. And so what we have is a situation where the military haven't actually paid for the expenses, as far as we can see, of the new administrative capital. The capital is not yet bringing in income. It's, needs to wrap up its phase one construction, laying infrastructure and so on, which the military does, and to move into actual, large scale residential construction and moving people in. In order to make that shift, more money is needed, and that's coming from banks apparently, which means that the largest owner of real estate in the new administrative capital, and probably in some of the other new smart upmarket cities, is the banks, which could mean, great value, of course, if all this pays off. But if it doesn't, then the banks are left holding a lot of dead capital. So going back to the IMF program, because now what happened is that the Egyptian government in its memorandum of 30 November promised the IMF to implement or to apply all the rules of financial reporting, audit, governance, transparency, etc., that are going to apply supposedly to across the state sector, across all civilian public agencies and companies, that these same rules will apply entirely to military companies. Now, that's very welcome news, or at least it's a very welcome statement. It legitimizes that demand and that expectation for the future. But it leaves out all military agencies that are active in the economy that aren't officially registered as companies. And as a final note there, I'll point out that, for example, it's the Armed Forces Procurement Department or some of these other departments that import massive amounts of frozen poultry or meat to dump in the market at cheap prices imported from Bulgaria, from Brazil and elsewhere, partly because they want to keep prices down for political reasons, and Sisi wants this. But of course, what they're doing is they're undercutting private sector producers who are starved of imports they need, such as the feed, to maintain production and to keep the prices of their own domestic products low enough for the market to afford. So there's a double whammy in terms of the damage done to private sector entrepreneurs. But this is also an area which is, strictly speaking, not covered by the Egyptians' commitment to the IMF.
No, thank you for that, Yazid. No, the private sector has definitely been struggling to compete with the military, given their array of anti-competitive advantages. We've been seeing that now for several years. It sounds like there's little indication that the military is going to move in a direction of actually complying with this agreement, and has a lot of different avenues for evading it. That said, I want to come back to you, Bob, and talk about, in the event that it sells off, at least on the civilian side, some of these key revenue streams to raise the hard currency that Egypt requires, are there things that can be done to strengthen the government's finances as it offloads sources of revenue to improve the country's current account balance? Are there sectors ripe for investment or other forms of support? And are there areas where improved tax capacity could help plug the deficit or at least bring it down?
Well, yes, there are. As regards the fiscal deficit, which is entirely domestic, there's a little more latitude. As far as on the revenue side, as you just mentioned, Tim, the tax situation is a major contributor to the problem of this increasing deficit. If you look at the tax take, it is heavily dependent on the indirect taxes, which the bank and the IMF have endorsed, which was the value-added tax, the percentage of gross government revenues that it's been attracting has been steadily rising, whereas the direct taxes on income, corporate profits, and on real estate has been falling. So the tax burden is enormously inequitable and exacerbates many of the other trends that are contributing to growing inequality and indeed impoverishment in the country. So it wouldn't take a revolution to begin to make a shift to a much more progressive taxation system and reduce the fiscal deficit, thereby making it possible, maybe once again, to attract at least some amount of the hot money that has fled out of the country in such significant magnitude over the last few years. On the expenditure side, the government doesn't have as much latitude. Sisi has said himself that he is going to be reducing, slowing up the amount of money spent on prestige projects. We don't know exactly what that amount was, nor do we know if it'll be acted upon. But presumably some savings can be had there. Elsewhere, there are very few opportunities. The expenditures on basic social services, health, education, various aspects of welfare have really been stripped to the bone. They have progressively declined as a percentage of the budget and in terms of individual shares in those allocations. So there's not a lot of room there. So it really does turn on taxation policy. As far as the current account deficit go, it's much more difficult because, of course, that involves Egypt's relations with the rest of the world. And this problem is accentuated by virtue of the fact that Egypt's imports are of a very high proportion are intermediate goods, which, as Yazid was just mentioning, include animal feed. So when you then interdict the importation of intermediate goods, such as animal and poultry feed, you have enormously disruptive consequences for the entire productive sector, which has happened as meat prices have skyrocketed, poultry prices, egg prices have gone up hugely, and the military has stepped into the void, but that does not address the fundamental problem. So one of the ways then by which you could begin to address the current account imbalance would be to try to do something to reduce the dependence on intermediate goods. In other words, for Egypt to have much more carefully integrated as opposed to segmented production sectors. So, for example, the Moroccans got into car manufacturing about a decade ago. The Egyptians got into car manufacturing in the late 1950s, early 1960s. The proportion of locally produced inputs in the Moroccan car industry is many times that of Egypt, despite this long history of Egypt and short history of Morocco. So you have segmented sectors of the economy. Now, if the privatization program had sought to address that problem by selling shares of these companies to individuals, whether Egyptian or otherwise, who were going to be then engaged in expanding the networks of production within particular sectors, you could have gone some way to addressing this. But instead, what the privatization program is, under the auspices of the IMF, is simply a scramble to get foreign currency. And there is absolutely nothing about the sales to GCC investors that's going to address the problem of non-integrated sectors of production and the heavy dependence, therefore, on imported intermediate goods. So things could be done, but Egypt's back, as Hafsa was saying, is really against the wall now. And so it's this desperate scramble to get foreign currency, which makes it much more difficult then to address the long-term problems. And it would not be easy. Egypt's current account balance is under severe threat. The Zohr gas field has been overpumped. The great gas boom of 2002 to 2008 is not going to come back. If we look at other export sectors, including, say, fertilizer and cement, they are heavily carbonized in Egypt. Within 5 years, the EU is going to be imposing tariffs on high carbon imports, of which Egypt is a prime example. So the long-term outlook for the current account balance is definitely negative unless and until something is done to integrate some sectors, and this privatization program was an opportunity to do that seems to have been lost. Thanks, Tim.
No, thank you, Bob, for all those insights. I have to agree also just that the struggle for a lot of Egypt's industrial actors is amplified by the complex customs regime. It's very difficult to move goods in and out of Egypt in an efficient fashion. It takes weeks to clear customs when things are running well, never mind when the government is trying to throttle imports. And that has also contributed to Egypt's difficulty in plugging into global supply chains, as well as an opportunity to increase and expand its industrial base. So Yazid, Bob talked about some of the things that Egypt might be able to do to improve its position or reduce its vulnerabilities. I wanted to talk to you about what other actors could do to help encourage that process of reform. So in light of the complexity of getting the military to reduce its damaging economic activities, as you pointed out, there's a lot of challenges in getting them out. They haven't been willing to do so far. If anything, they're expanding. Is there anything, or are there specific areas that the IMF and Egypt's other international partners should look out for in anticipating attempts at evading the current agreements? And are there any specific structural benchmarks the IMF could introduce that could help perhaps block those attempts at evasion going forward? Also, the World Bank and the EBRD are planning to bring in several $billions in financing to help Egypt's private sector expand. Are there conditions or plans that they could introduce that would help constrain the military's economic excesses to create more space for a competitive private sector in Egypt?
Well, thanks, Tim. I mean, I want to start by saying that I don't think the issue should always be seen as how to push the military out of the economy, pure and simple. And doing that is basically taking on a mammoth task politically. That's not going to happen. And the military right now remain on an an expansionary trajectory. So I think, try and pick battles better. And rather than focus on that, I would focus on getting more of what the military does in the civilian domain to conform to the same sets of rules of transparency and accounting and governance, et cetera, as any other civilian actor is subject to in that same domain. That, I think, is the easy way. And that's why the Egyptian government, in fact, committed to doing exactly that with respect to the military companies in their recent pledge to the IMF. Now, I actually published 2 papers last year full of concrete recommendations, one addressed to the government of Egypt, basically, and one to the IMF directly, in which I suggested that rather than try simply and dismantle everything that the military does in the civilian economy, after all, it can actually do a lot that is beneficial. And I don't want us to think that everything the military does is necessarily bad or driven for all the wrong motives or bad for the economy per se. And a lot of the real problems derive from the president's approach to state-led investment rather than purely what the military does, although the military appetite, of course, does also deepen and reinforce the tendencies that Sisi already has. So one set of companies and activities I think that the military are involved in are maybe good or legitimate, and that's, for instance, in this area of defense industry, and that could be retained and even upgraded with a proper focus and proper investment and proper business practice. A second set would be restructuring, and here's where I want to make a recommendation, which I think is a more constructive one, and that is that there are around 20 to 32 various companies, military companies basically, that are registered as one kind or another of public sector company, and therefore already nominally subject to the rules, the same rules as the rest of the public sector. These are companies which in many cases are dual. They do defense-related production and also civilian. And I think the primary recommendation would be to hive off the civilian activity, put that under a different heading, maybe even different companies, and establish a clear firewall between the two so that the civilian side of this could come totally under financial disclosure and transparency, et cetera. And as a further set of companies, around 40, I'd say, or so companies, mostly those owned by the National Service Projects Organization and therefore the Ministry of Defense, in many cases aren't even registered as public sector companies at all. Their registration, no one ever really bothered registering them properly. They don't have clear rules of operation and so on. These could be transformed into public sector companies and therefore then brought into the same framework as in the first set, i.e. hived, where there's a separation. Because in fact, most of these companies, the latter set of NSPO companies, don't actually do anything defense related. They're entirely civilian related. And so they should be simply put into the same basket as the rest of the public, civilian public sector. So I think there's all sorts of things of this kind that can be engaged in a productive way that are less about taking everything away from the military and more about getting it to agree to various kinds of distinctions that could actually make these companies more profitable. And that takes me to my last point, which is that while the IMF has pushed hard for a standardized unified public procurement law that would affect all agencies and which the military should come under in relation to all its civilian projects and activities, the key issue for me is transparency and disclosure. Books, audits, etc., financial reporting, these are the things When it comes to civilian affairs, that should be 100% opened up and subject to the normal state regulations. That's where I'd put my emphasis rather than on issues of ownership, for instance. I mean, whether who owns this or that military company is less important than the governance structure. And that's where I think that if there's to be privatization, and again, I'm not ideologically committed to privatization, but if there is to be, then better it's done through the Egyptian Stock Exchange, which has a good reputation and will demand proper financial disclosure, than by selling off to hidden unknown investors, and where the assets are managed by the sovereign fund of Egypt, which in effect leaves the state effectively in control, and where some of the bad practices or bad debt, etc., held by these companies are hidden. And that's partly why the only two military companies that have been officially on the book for eventual IPOs for the last 3.5 years, Safi and Wataniya, one has to ask why nothing has happened so far. And I think it's because of the huge mess they are in terms of their bookkeeping and their internal accounting and inventory.
Thank you, Yazid. I share your view about the importance being more in terms of regularizing the military's activities than a full cessation of their economic activities. Also, last year in the recommendations that I put forward, my emphasis was on transparency, on tax obligations, on making sure that they were subject to the same labor rules instead of using conscripts as some of them do, and things of that nature. I think that would be an important step in terms of making them less of an anti-competitive force in the economy, and also less of a drain on state resources as they currently are, and presenting substantive opportunity costs to the state because they engage in such expansive activities without paying any taxes, while the state is dealing with, as Bob noted, a serious problem in terms of the amount of tax revenue that they're bringing in. A political economist who will remain nameless for obvious reasons, in a discussion I was in, noted that he doubts that the Gulf sincerely cares if the military is involved in the economy, and he argued that this is probably not really their main concern. They don't, but I wanted to ask you, Hamza, what is it that the Gulf does want to see? What kind of steps could Egypt take to rebuild confidence with their Gulf partners? You talked about that there's a lack of trust now, and that they've been very disappointed in the way that Egypt has used the funds that they've taken from the Gulf in the past several years. What is it that could happen? What steps could be taken to rebuild that trust? And what would the Gulf perhaps be open to doing on top of asset purchases? Is there an appetite still to be more generous in terms of the terms of lending and the maturity of existing debt?
Thanks, Tim. I don't necessarily disagree with the comments that you've made about the questionable or the question of relevance to the Gulf states about the military's role in the economy and its size. It's really beyond that. And I have long, for many years, been accused of being slightly sensationalist in work I've done across the region and things that I throw out there. But we really are hitting a moment where the Gulf states no longer believe there is political will within this leadership to change anything. And that is a much bigger existential question, not just in terms of a bit of money here or a bit of money there. You know, in fantastic detail, my esteemed colleagues have laid out how this has happened, you know, who is in charge, the roles and the power. The reality is, why has this happened? And over the last 10 years, this has been a case of accruing political legitimacy and plausible deniability within the institution to back an ouster of power and entrench and legitimize power in a certain way in this country. For those who have not complied, we've seen generals purged and ousted. For those who have not complied, you know, this is not just the military wanting its cake and eating it too. They have actively taken over private sector investment and appropriated projects, not just land, to take things over themselves. This is a deeper web and the decrees, not just of conscripts, but the exemptions, the tax exemptions, the housing facilities, everything that is built to create an institution that is a state within a state. This is what we're at now. To dismantle that is, clearly at the moment, the message being sent, and I'll quote unofficially a meeting I had with a banker in Egypt when I was there just 3 weeks ago or so, when he just said, you want to show the Gulf states you're serious, don't give them small banks and 10% or 20%, give them all of it. Because the real question is, in terms of what can Egyptians do, or what do the Gulf states want, or why are the Gulf states demanding this or that, or cherry picking their companies? I mean, one has to ask themselves, and I don't say that as someone who's now living in the UAE, why should they help? They have poured all this money into the country. They have asked for commitments. And that's certainly the message I get from Saudi officials that I speak to after the June meeting between the Crown Prince and the president in Cairo is, we asked, we demanded, and he did nothing. So we have to reach a point where we're saying, why should they help? Honestly, from the Gulf states' perspective, how much of this is a national security issue, a return on investment issue, the reasons behind why they will do what they do? There is a bottom. I do believe there is a bottom where the Gulf states are not going to do a Lebanon. They're not going to abandon Egypt in this sense. I believe that bottom is default. Nevertheless, if there is continued lack of political will being showcased from the presidency and from the regime in the country, the Gulf states will not oblige. It's not about giving them a bigger bank and selling them Banque du Caire instead of United. It's not about giving them this over that, or, the cataract with the Winter Palace or whatever it is. It's a much deeper problem than that. And we have seen, not just in Lebanon, but we saw it in Sudan 5 years ago, and we've seen it in other contexts. When they want to withdraw, they withdraw. And the Egyptians really have not, I don't believe, understood what that means and how true that might actually be. And that's really a question for the Egyptian regime more than it is for anyone else.
Thank you, Hafsa. No, I think that it's really clear that the Gulf is restructuring their relationship with all of the people that they've been providing financial support for. And from what I've heard, also one of the reasons behind that is that the public has also demanded more accountability for the way that this money is being spent. The Gulf is not. The Gulf actually borrows money sometimes now. Saudi Arabia is the largest emerging market bond issuer in the world today. And there have been, rolling back of some government privileges to the society. And so when they see billions of dollars going to Egypt and they see the Egyptian government spending that money in I would say reckless fashion, to put it mildly, people want answers. People want to understand why that money should continue to flow in that direction. And that's pressure that's on them. I think people forget sometimes that even in autocratic contexts, there is public pressure, and autocrats do at times feel a need to address the grievances of their publics and maintain legitimacy in their eyes. And that I think you raise really key points there. And I think that the too big to fail question, thank you for raising that, because that's where I want to go with this. I think in the past, I've been asked about what was the Egyptian government thinking, and I said they think they're too big to fail. And what I've suggested in the past is that they may not understand what that means, right? Too big to fail doesn't mean continuing to have this easy access to credit that we've seen. It might mean being on life support, which is kind of where they're finding themselves at this moment. And with that, I want to talk to Ishaq. You have more familiarity with kind of the mechanisms available in the international financial system. You were looking at Egypt's debt, and in your piece, you raised real questions about the sustainability of that debt. And I was wondering what could be done at this point to bring Egypt's debt under control, to make it more manageable. Is there a role IFIs can play in restructuring of that debt? Or is that unrealistic in light of the fact that much of this debt is held outside of the Paris Club, outside of the G7, by the IMF, by Gulf states and China? And how real is the risk of default at this time? As you put it, is Egypt too big to bail instead of too big to fail?
I want to turn this question a little bit around, if I may.
Please.
Maybe instead of arguing it's too large to bail, I want to argue perhaps that it's better not to bail out Egypt at this stage. We should focus on the Egyptian people a little bit. To start with your debt issue, actually, most of the Egyptian debt is domestic. It's not external. Maybe 25% is external. It's really a problem of domestic debt. And with this big devaluation of more than 50%, the savings of Egyptian people, their pensions have been expropriated, reduced in real value by half for the second time in a decade. I mean, that's the real tragedy. If people work hard and accumulate money and the government borrows it and use it to invest in not very productive things, doesn't let the private sector develop. So and every 10 years, it just expropriates their savings. What this country needs is not something very complicated, is the way out, is a dynamic national private sector, which was never allowed to grow. From the time we go to the 80s and before that to Sadat and Fitah, it was always a partial infitah. We want to manage the private sector. We're afraid of an autonomous private sector from a political perspective. We want to manage, controlled private sector, whether it's the cronies of Mubarak or the army today. Now, what you all said that selling the crown jewels is not enough. What is the signal? If we elevate ourselves a little bit, what is being signaled here? We want a new economic model where the GCC and the army operate the economy in order not to have an autonomous, competitive private sector. Is that a feasible, workable model for the future? I don't think so. So, when Yazid, you speak about, competitively selling shares, we're talking about allowing actually a bourgeois capitalist national class to rise. And so I think we want to listen. I think this is a very important moment. Clearly, during a moment of crisis, there are meetings, strategies, brainstorming, and decisions will be made. And those privatization will signal what kind of future is the leadership willing to propose to the country. And so it's much more than just the short-term foreign exchange that will be collected to deal with the crisis. It's whether the regime would be able to instill some trust and confidence with its population. I think that's the real issue at hand.
Thank you, Ishaq. With that, I want to turn to our audience's questions. And just as a reminder, if you want to ask anything, please use the Q&A function. One specific question that I think, Yazid, you're perhaps best positioned to answer. One of our audience members asks if we can technically say the military owns 51% of Nuka, because there are retired generals on the board, but it's not linked to the Ministry of Defense. And if so, are we seeing a sort of civilianization of military businesses and assets where they're not formally part of the military establishment, but are functionally captured by retired officers? I think you've written about this kind of vagueness in terms of businesses affiliated with retired officers and things of that nature, and perhaps you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Everything I've seen says that it's the Ministry of Defense that owns 51% of the new administrative capital company, and I just don't have more information than that. I frankly don't think that having a number of retired generals on the board is a sufficient security for the military of its stake in this particular instance. And what would that mean? That they hold the equity in their own personal names? That's not actually how it functions. Although there are maybe other cases, such as the National Authority for Management and Investment that I mentioned earlier, where there could be, where there appears to be something that has ambiguous legal status acting on behalf of the military without it being officially owned or acknowledged by the military. I'm happy to reconsider if there's actual information on that. But if I may, because I've looked at the questions and there's a couple more on the military, I want to say something else that tackles one of the other questions. The issue here, there's a question about, if the military exited entirely, what impact that would have on things like prices. Would they soar, et cetera? Would there be a huge disruption to the market? I want to emphasize again that while the military, we need to be very careful in what we attribute to the military in terms of impacts or in terms of how it pushes and changes the economy. And it's definitely gained an appetite of its own and pushes and does things on its own for sure. But most of this has developed in the context of a president coming from the military, but who since 2014 has developed a particular vision of how to drive growth in Egypt, how to generate jobs, how to generate revenue for the state. So he's shaped an investment strategy led by the state in which he's inviting private investment, but under state control very clearly. And the military has been his tool for this. Now, the point I want to make here is that because Sisi is so committed to massive investment and doing things in a rush and doing them without proper cost-benefit analysis, without feasibility studies, as he boasts publicly, what we get therefore is that there's a lot of wasteful investment. I mean, who really worked out that from an economic perspective, or even from a logistical perspective in terms of traffic congestions in downtown Cairo, that a whole new capital was really necessary? And was it really necessary on this scale at this time? The road network, et cetera, all these investment decisions, the priorities and the scale of them, where things are done on a massive scale without a pilot study to test the concept, et cetera. So there's a massive overinvestment in a few sectors to the deprivation of other sectors of the economy. This is the whole approach. So this isn't the military per se, although the military is part of this and benefits from this and maybe wants it to be maintained. But the issue is not, that's where the real impacts on prices, on availability of supply, et cetera, on the proper balance between supply and demand, on letting market forces operate, on letting the private sector operate. There are all sorts of other problems, but there are proper agencies of the state that are meant to be regulating pricing and regulating, imports of food stuff and so on. So again, it's not to simplify this into a binary of military in or out. There's a bigger picture here of why investment is being managed in the way it is.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Yazid. I think those are really crucial points to complicate the picture a bit. I'm going to invite our participants to, and we can all see the questions, to respond to the questions they feel are their best position to respond. And I just want to throw one in myself that I think perhaps Hamza and Ishaq might be interested in addressing, given their experiences. To what extent do you view selling publicly owned companies to publicly owned sovereign wealth funds of other states as privatization? It's been cast like that, but the idea has always not sat right with me. And so I invite you to comment on that if you'd like. And of course, there's the other questions. If each of you could take 2-3 minutes tops, that would be great. Perhaps we start with you, Hamza.
Thanks, Tim. I'm actually going to leave that question for Ishaq to respond to if he chooses to, because two questions have caught my eye. One is on Gulf reluctance to invest with the support of the regime in Cairo, and the other is the issue of democratization. And the reason I want to address these two issues is because certainly over the years, particularly in certain capitals in the international community and amongst the intelligentsia think tank community over in many places, there's this real reluctance to change the paradigm. We're stuck when it comes to Egypt to 2013. And in many ways with the Gulf, we're stuck in 2018. These are not Gulf regimes that are the same as they were when the Yemen war started. This is not the same Saudi leader as we saw in 2018. These are fast changing, fast evolving, fast maturing leaderships. They're also, particularly in Saudi and Qatar, very young leaderships. So policies change, and they can change overnight, and they shift greatly. So that idea of the Gulf states being this this entity, the GCC being synonymous with the UAE, the Gulf states all being on the same page, the policy with Egypt comes across as them all being in cahoots with each other. But reality is that their national interests are dictating what in an outcome is the same approach. The problem when you look at Sisi's regime in Cairo is, for a lot of people in the international community, we're stuck in 2013, where the idea is economic security versus democratization, stability, security versus chaos. What we have to understand with the question of democratization writ large is Egyptians willfully gave up an opportunity to further the democratization program, not because of major security threats and breaches, but primarily and underlyingly because of economic security. Now it's that relationship that has become irrevocably fractured as of now. And what we need to do when we're looking at Egypt is not a case of 0 to 100. If there aren't 300,000 people in Tahrir Square, then we're not in the case of pushing forward on democratization. We now have an active civilian political opposition that is vocal, that is present, that is doing things 5-6 years ago they could never say or do in the country. We have a citizenry that is activated, engaged, reading. We have journalists who are breaking outside of the rules that are provided on them to discuss the question of where did the money go? So all these things are elements of democratization that mean we have to look at Egypt in 2023 and not look at it through the lens of 2013. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Hafsa. Ishaq, would you dare to try to answer that question?
Very hard to come after Hafsa. I'm really so convinced by what you said. I mean, you know, the issue of privatization, I kind of wonder why it became so central suddenly. It's obfuscating the real issues. It's a secondary issue. And suddenly we're only talking about privatization and selling a few military companies. I mean, is that Egypt's problem? Egypt's problem is deeper than that. It's really how you dynamize the society, how you have a dynamic private sector, you know, small firms, large firms, and not GCC firms or military firms only, to neutralize the potential. It's not a technical issue, you know, how I privatize. It's a political issue. It's how political leadership wakes up to the challenge. So it's really, I'm much more interested by the political dialogue that's ongoing. I mean, I think this is really where it might happen. You know, after all, when he found himself, a previous president, Sadat, in a similar situation, you know, he went to Jerusalem. It was a big break with where he was coming from. And we are at the moment like that. I mean, we have to ask, which is Sisi's Jerusalem? He has to find a new Jerusalem right now. A way for the country to politically come together and propose a project that would represent progress. And that would involve building a new coalition, not just the military, but a part of the population that will gain from reform, that would buy into a dream and accept short-term costs in order, because they see light at the end of the tunnel, and a coalition that can neutralize the opposition from military interest or others that do not want to move in this direction because of, you know, myopia. You know, they may be afraid of losing their interest today, but they have to be convinced that it's better for their kids if we go another way. I think we're at a moment where this is what we need to talk about. Not just how to privatize a few companies.
Thank you. I think that the thrust behind that question is that if they remain in your words, the politically connected firms, right? If these companies get transferred from one public owner to another, remain politically connected firms owned by an international ownership that has undue leverage over the Egyptian state, given its vulnerabilities, that it prevents precisely the dynamism in the private sector that you're saying Egypt needs. And that's really where my concern is derived from, less than whether or not they're public or private, but more that there's actually an elaboration of the web of politically connected firms that are kind of suffocating Egypt's ability to have a dynamic private sector. And with respect to the political openings, I'm afraid that they're still quite limited. I need to say that. I mean, the reality is that even as the national dialogue was convening, members of the parties that were participating were being arrested. The unfortunate reality is, despite the theater of creating openings, there's still an unwillingness on the part of a lot of the leadership to really substantively move forward. And while people are being more vocal because of the desperation of the situation, we're seeing people take remarkable risks to criticize the government and criticize the economic conditions. They're also going to prison for it. And so, unfortunately, for now at least, that political opening is being fought for, but has not successfully been achieved. I do hope that we make progress on that front. With that, I want to turn it over to Bob to kind of have the last stab at the questions that we have before us, or make any final points you'd like to add.
Well, let me basically just add a footnote to what Ishak basically just said and what all of you have said. We finally come to the nub of the matter here. And that this is a political problem at the core of it, manifested in all these very bad economic ways that we've been describing. And since I'm the sort of oldest guy in the room, let me reflect on the length of this political problem, which at the core of is the role of the military. And back in the 1980s, when in the wake of the peace treaty with Israel, the question arose as to what to do with this military, which at its maximum was over 800,000 strong, but by that stage had been shrunk down to around 500,000, which was far too great for a country that was at peace with its only meaningful threat at all. And the issue was resolved by virtue of the argument that the military could do things besides fight wars. It could help develop the economy. And the bank pushed back a little bit against that. And the American embassy pushed back a little bit, but not strongly enough. And so that was the sort of seed that was sown at the time that gave the military a legitimate role, kept it at a far large size, and its claim on national resources greatly excessive. Interestingly enough, the one turning point came at the time of the apparent Mubarak transition to his son Gamal. And at that stage, the thoughts were, among those of us who were very opposed to the role of the military as it had developed, was that crony capitalists were not great, and Gamal Mubarak was their spokesperson after all, but they were an awful lot better than what the military was. And it was precisely that calculation that led Sisi and the military to do what they did, was to make sure that there was not a transition to a civilian government. So we now have this huge elephant in the room that has a very long history, going back, of course, to 52, but in its current form, going back to the mid-1980s. And so to deal with that shooting elephants, as George Orwell talked about in his famous short story, is a difficult sort of thing. But that's the core of the problem. And much as I'd like to agree with you, Yazid, that we can get at it in these various ways, sort of a guerrilla war as opposed to a major confrontation with it, we'll see. Hanshuf, maybe it'll work. Maybe one should certainly try, but I think it's probably going to take a bigger elephant gun than subjecting some of the military firms, for example, to normal procurement procedures and so on. So there is a huge problem in Egypt. It is the military, and the rest is really subordinate to that.
Thanks so much, Bob. Those are really important considerations, and actually the PhD thesis that I'm allegedly working on aligns with this argument, which is that I think that a motivation that escapes, I think, a lot of people's attention is that this isn't just about money. It's not just about financial resources for the regime. The economic strategy of the military and of Sisi and of the regime that he's created has been also to kind of control the distribution of wealth in Egypt in such a way that the crony capitalists can't reemerge as a center of power in the regime as they were rising under Mubarak in his later years. And in that respect, they've been successful. They've conditionally reintegrated them to play certain particular roles as surrogates of the regime, but certainly not the political role that they played previously. Even the Nation's Future Party ostensibly has no policies. It doesn't even pretend to, whereas the National Democratic Party had bad policies at times, but at least it had them. It was engaged politically. There were participants in the process. I want to thank you all for this extremely stimulating conversation. It was fascinating. And I do encourage our audience again to visit the Carnegie Middle East Center's website to read the articles of all of the authors here. They're all very insightful and really will help you understand kind of what's happening in Egypt and where things might be going. As we can see, the prognosis is not very promising, but hopefully there will be a way to avert a greater disaster. And with that, I wish you a good afternoon or a good rest of your day, and take care. And we'll hopefully see you again soon. Also, for those of you who want, you can view this again on YouTube, and you'll be able to share it with your colleagues. Thank you so much and take care.